using machine learning to predict the effects of nitrous oxide in relation to hypoxic zones. Existing predictive models to measure nitrous oxide emissions rely on copious amounts of data from different sources to make accurate predictions. Using machine learning principles, this project takes a novel approach towards measuring N2O emissions. It creates an original algorithmic formula in order to predict trends and the average annual increase of nitrous oxide emissions in comparison to carbon dioxide and ocean dead zones. The project aims to demonstrate the large-scale impacts nitrous oxide has on global warming. It also aims to illustrate the direct causal links between an elevated hypoxic zone count and a continued increase in anthropogenic nitrous oxide emissions. Nitrous oxide is a long-lived, potent greenhouse gas that has an average atmospheric lifetime of 114 years. It is one of the main contributors to global warming. Since the Industrial Revolution, the atmospheric concentration of nitrous oxide has increased by 20%. It has gone from 270 parts per billion in 1750 to 331 parts per billion in 2018, with the fastest growth being in the last 50 years. Emitters of nitrous oxide include industrial agricultural practices, transportation, wastewater treatment, and ocean dead zones. In the last 4 decades, we have experienced an unprecedented increase in anthropogenic nitrous oxide emissions of 30%. Furthermore, nitrous oxide has a global warming potential of 300, meaning that one molecule of nitrous oxide has the same effect as 300 molecules of carbon dioxide. In other words, the long-term effects of nitrous oxide are equally as or more harmful than carbon dioxide. Ocean dead zones are a net source for nitrous oxide emissions, accounting for about 25% of global N2O emissions. Ocean dead zones or hypoxic zones are caused by synthetic fertilizer runoff that is high in nitrogen and phosphorus from industrialized agricultural plants. The runoff runs into large bodies of water and creates algae blooms. Algae blooms attract microbes called cyanobacteria that break down the algae and in doing so use up all the dissolved oxygen in the water. Organisms suffocate because of lack of oxygen in hypoxic zones. The cyanobacteria release the nitrous oxide in its gaseous form, which collects in sediment sinks. This process is called eutrophication. After the eutrophication, upwelling forces the nitrous oxide towards the surface, which evaporates along with the water and goes into our atmosphere. The vast expanse of the ocean is difficult to accumulate accurate data for because of its large size and constant changes. The objective of this project is to predict the effects of nitrous oxide using an algorithmic predictive formula to find the trend and the average yearly increase of nitrous oxide emissions. My hypothesis is that the long-term effects of nitrous oxide emissions will be equally as or more harmful than carbon dioxide emissions. I predict that there will be a causal link between nitrous oxide emissions and an increasing ocean dead zone count because of the high levels of nitrous oxide ocean dead zones emit. The first step was to establish the objectives my predictive algorithm should achieve. The first objective was to be able to account for the potency of nitrous oxide to accurately determine the extent of the impact nitrous oxide will have on global warming. The second objective was to be able to calculate the average yearly increase of the nitrous oxide emissions. The third was to enable easy accessibility and allow for others who don't necessarily know how to code to use my algorithm as a tool to make sure that we have reached our expectations when it comes to mitigating our nitrous oxide or greenhouse gas emissions. I watched a 6-hour Python coding course where I learned how to code and the syntax that was involved in Python. I downloaded an open source Python platform called Jupyter Notebook and a Python interpreter called PyCharm. Then I spent the equivalent of 36 hours over a month-long period creating the algorithm and debugging it. I collected data from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, air pollutant emissions of Canada, global fossil fuel CO2 emissions, and a research paper done by the American Association for the Advancement of Science. This was the most comprehensive study I could find on ocean dead zones within the past 20 years. The algorithm takes a dataset represented by a variable and finds the percent increase of every two numbers of the dataset in consecutive order. These increases are represented by another dataset. The average of this dataset was found and is stored in a variable called real average increase. The real average increase was then multiplied by the difference between a year that I had inputted into the algorithm and the last year that the dataset had data for. This difference was multiplied exponentially by the average increase and then added to the last number in the first dataset to find the projected number. This was then graphed into Jupyter Notebook. After the first simulation, I found the average yearly increase of nitrous oxide emissions was 0.5%, relative to carbon dioxide's increase of 0.9%. Every year, carbon dioxide emissions increase by 0.4% more than nitrous oxide. While there is still a variance between the carbon dioxide and the nitrous oxide yearly increase, nitrous oxide is still 300 times more potent. If we solely focus on reducing carbon dioxide emissions, nitrous oxide emissions will continue to rise. This means that if we continue as we are, the carbon dioxide emissions will continue to increase at a faster rate than nitrous oxide, but we still need to mitigate our nitrous oxide emissions because without an intervention, our emissions will continue to grow. The second simulation assessed the ocean dead zone count. The average annual increase of the ocean dead zones count was found to be 7%. Hypoxic zones emit 25% of global nitrous oxide emissions. This shows if they continue increasing at this alarming rate, the yearly rate of increase for nitrous oxide emissions will also increase with similar fluctuations. Therefore, the first step towards completely eliminating our nitrous oxide emissions is to eliminate ocean dead zones. The third simulation represents the atmospheric concentrations of both nitrous oxide and carbon dioxide in comparison to each other from 1990 to 2017. After running these three simulations, I have found that because of the direct correlation between hypoxic zones and nitrous oxide emissions, an intervention to eliminate hypoxia is needed. The predictive algorithm I created has many applications towards the collection and analysis of data related to nitrous oxide emissions. I believed it could be used to monitor our greenhouse gas emissions and as a tool to meet short-term goals. One of the limitations of my predictive model is that if it's not updated, for every year that is projected, the results become less accurate. Another limitation to the accuracy of the ocean dead zone data is that ocean dead zones greatly vary in size and depth, which directly affects its nitrous oxide output. In conclusion, using an original algorithmic formula, this project strived to demonstrate the serious threat nitrous oxide emissions pose to the environment, as well as the urgent need to mitigate nitrous oxide emissions and reduce ocean dead zone counts. Even though my predictive simulation showed that carbon dioxide is increasing at a faster rate than nitrous oxide, it is important to remember that nitrous oxide is 300 times more potent and has an average atmospheric lifetime of 114 years. As shown by the second simulation, hypoxic zones have increased by 7% annually, and nitrous oxide will start to increase at a faster rate and may eventually outpace CO2 emissions in the future. The algorithmic formula I created has many applications towards the collection and analysis of data related to nitrous oxide emissions, particularly in local communities. I believe simple algorithmic formulae like my own could be used as a tool to monitor N2O gas emissions, particularly in coastal areas with existing or threat of hypoxic zones. It can help set and meet short-term goals and reduce the threat of global warming. Thank you.